It's one thing to listen to doom and gloom about food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation. It's quite another thing to hear practical, immediately actionable advice from experts who can help you reduce the fear, anxiety, and burden of these problems. Tune in now to the Surviving Hard Times podcast from the Finding Genius Foundation with Richard Jacobs. Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out, and I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now to our guest. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Surviving Hard Times podcast, sponsored by the Finding Genius Foundation.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs. My guest today is Susan Poizner. She's the founder of Orchard People. We're going to talk about growing urban orchards, which sounds like a really cool idea. I guess even if you have like 1 or 2 trees or bushes or whatever it may be, and you can grow and eat your own fruit. I've done that in the past, and it was a really cool experience. So we're going to talk about that today. Welcome, Susan. Thank you.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me.
Tell me a bit about your background and how you got into growing and, why fruit and why orchards?
Wow. Well, it's been quite a journey for me. My background is I'm a journalist and I was a filmmaker, and I really didn't touch the soil until my 30s, actually, until I met my husband, and he's from Trinidad. And so in Trinidad, you just throw down a seed and something grows and it ends up being delicious. So when we moved in together, he looked at the backyard and he said, "Hey, we could be growing stuff here." And I'm like, "Yeah, I don't think so. It's just going to be a mess, and I don't want this to be my job." And anyways, luckily, Richard, he persevered because we ended up planting a garden. I fell in love with gardening and growing things. And as much as I love growing vegetables, the more I gardened, the more I realized that trees are so amazing. A zucchini plant will live a season and produce, some zucchinis, which is great. But a fruit tree can live 25 years, can live 50 years, can live 100 years, can feed us for generations. Yeah. And when I realized that, I realized this is something that I want to learn more about.
Yeah, that's really cool. One mystery, with growing trees, I guess it takes X number of years for them to bear fruit. Do you know if anyone that's studied on how to accelerate that process or why it takes X number of years for certain fruits to come and not for others?
It's a great question, and the answer is, just like with us humans, we take a while to mature, right? So a baby is born, and then it needs to grow up a little bit, and then it needs to go through puberty and teenage years, and then it's ready to reproduce. So when a fruit tree produces fruit, it is in its reproductive stage, and it does take time. But I wrote a book called Grow Fruit Trees Fast because there are a lot of people out there that think, well, why can't I grow fruit? Fruit in the supermarket is so expensive, and especially organic fruit. And there are these trees and they produce fruit, and, why don't I give it a try? So for my book, Grow Fruit Trees Fast, I researched all the best ways to make this whole experience go quicker, so that you plant a tree and no, you won't get fruit the next day, but you will get fruit within 2 years. And that's pretty fast. When you think that if you take a seed from an apple and you plant it in the ground, it could take 5, 6, 7 years until it produces fruit. And the seed from that apple, even if it's the most delicious, yummy apple in the world, that new tree may not produce yummy tasting apples. That will be a totally unique and different apple tree that produces apples, but they won't taste like the parent apples.
What kind of fruits are easy to grow, especially in an urban environment that don't take 10,000 years?
Yeah, well, Richard, I'm not sure that any fruits are easy to grow, fruit trees. You see, the difference is between a fruit tree and a native tree. A native tree is usually grown from seed. And even native trees, when you plant the little seedling, you've got to water it, you've got to care for it until it establishes itself. And then after that, you don't usually have to prune it too much. You shouldn't really need to feed it too much. They take care of themselves. But fruit trees are actually like little Franken trees, because in order to get the kind of fruit you want, let's say you like Honeycrisp apples, you need to get a grafted tree. So it has a piece of either the original Honeycrisp apple tree or one of its descendants, another cutting. Basically, a cutting from a tree will be grafted onto a rootstock so that you will get the actual fruit that you want. So these Franken trees need a little more care. They can be delicate. We need to feed them properly. We need to prune them annually. And the pruning will help ensure not only that the tree is healthy, but also that every branch gets access to sunshine so the fruit ripens properly. So there's a few things that you need to consider. You need to, for sure, irrigate the trees unless it's a good rainy season, but especially when they're young, and you need to feed them. So is any fruit tree easy? I don't think so. But saying that, there are people that plant a cherry tree in their backyard or even an apple tree, and they give that tree minimal care. And if they're lucky, it will be a beautiful, productive tree that produces yummy fruit. But essentially what I teach people is how to increase your chances of success. Just between you and I, just so you know, and I know, apple trees are amongst the hardest to grow because apple trees attract something like 36 different types of pests. And these pests these pests lay their eggs under the skin of the baby fruit. So you think the fruit is fine, but then it grows up and then it's got maggots and stuff under the skin. So it's got 36 pests. It's got a handful of diseases that it gets. Whereas cherry trees, they still have pests and they still have diseases, but there might be fewer of them. So my attitude is this. It's about when you're going out to buy a tree, you're thinking, I want to have a partnership with this tree. I'll do my part, the tree will do its part, and together we will produce an amazing harvest. If that's your attitude, you will have the most delicious harvest and the abundant harvest that you can dream of for years and years to come. But if it's about, I want a fruit tree in my yard, I want it to do all the work, and I just want to reap the rewards, you might be disappointed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. So what are the easier ones then? If apples are tough, what about peaches?
Peaches
figs?
can be peaches can be tough. I would say, well, it's hard to say. Apples are tough, but still worth doing. I think cherries are easier. There are native trees, native fruiting trees like service berries, and they are a native tree. They take care of themselves. You really don't have to do much. And the berries, if you wait until they're a beautiful purpley red, they're kind of almost like blueberries. So that is totally hands off. Then there's another native tree in parts of North America called the pawpaw tree, and it's beautiful. It's not a papaya, it's a pawpaw, and it's this beautiful fruit that sort of looks like, it's a little bit mango-ish in how it looks from the outside, and you slice it open, and it's like this beautiful texture, silky, yummy flavor. And that's also pretty low maintenance because it's a native tree. But of the other trees, I would say it's the kind of thing that if you're willing to do a little bit of work and learn a little bit about how to care for these trees, you'll have great rewards, but you do have to do some work.
How do you get someone to plant a tree and then not be bored until the fruit comes? Because 2 years, I could see, I'd be really excited about it. I plant it, I water it, it starts to grow, I'm happy. And then after a year, I'm like, gotta wait a whole nother year for fruit. And then, I would guess this between the first and second years, if it takes 2 years, would be probably the toughest. What do you see?
Well, Yeah, what I see is that the people who, like, again, I wrote my book, Grow Fruit Trees Fast, so that people could read it fast. You read it in an hour and you see what's involved. So people who know what's involved are kind of excited about the different stages, just like you have a baby. And it's not like, okay, kid, look, hurry up and grow up because I want to be able to play checkers with you. And right now you can't even, figure out how to move your fingers, right? So every stage in growing a fruit tree can be interesting, and especially since when you are growing a fruit tree strategically so that it will produce a healthy and abundant harvest, you're actually pruning it from the first year that you planted. So pruning is like sculpting a tree. It's like creating a sculpture, and it's actually very creative. There is a strategy and a skill behind it. So people like me, and maybe I'm just weird, we get excited about the pruning season, and we get excited about watching how the tree reacts to the pruning. We get excited when we see the baby fruit starting to form. But here, the problem is for the first 2 years, we delicately pick it off, all that baby fruit, so that the tree can then put its energy into its root system rather than pushing out fruit for us. Yeah. So for the first 2 years, you're saying, okay, I'm going to sacrifice my need to have like instant gratification so that my tree will be healthy and establish itself. Because I could pick the fruit for the first 2 years and then have a weak tree for the next 15 years or 20 years. Or I can give it the love and attention it needs in the early years and have a tree that could live 50 years or 100 years, depending on the kind of tree that I plant.
Maybe this is getting nerdy, but is there software where you could kind of input how many branches you have and how thick they are and map out the tree, and then have like the computer would tell you where to prune to make sure to maximize the tree's, growth properly? Maybe it's getting, again, crazy or nerdy, but has anyone thought of such a thing?
It's not nerdy. And is there software? I don't think so, but we become human software. So in the same way that when you are a sculptor, you kind of have to look at your, piece of clay and clump of clay and you see what you need. There actually is a strategy, Richard, and it's so simple, but you just need to learn it. So it takes, 2 hours maybe to learn. I can teach somebody in 2 hours how to prune, and then they go out and they look at the tree, and each time they prune, they're reinforcing those lessons. It's really quite simple. You're creating a structure, a strong fruit-bearing structure for the tree. And essentially, the central leader type of pruning that I do, you want your tree to look like a Christmas tree with a strong central branch and branches that go out to the side, longer at the bottom, shorter at the top. But there's little tricks. You want room in between the branches for air circulation. So it's not even that complicated. It's just practice. And the results are very beautiful. Just to look at the tree when it's blossoming, when it's fully leafed out, and of course when it's fruiting. So it's beautiful, but it's also a really productive and useful way to be growing your trees.
Yeah, I think you'd have to step back from the tree over and over and look. Oh, okay. Over there. I don't know.
Absolutely.
It's like a gigantic bonsai.
Yes. And actually, with regards to gigantic, smaller trees are easier to take care of. They're easier to harvest. And if you prune at the right time of year, you can keep your tree compact. And if you get the right tree, it's all, there's all these little factors. So I understand why you're saying, a computer program, because in a way it would be useful. You could type into the program and say, look, I want a tree because I have a small yard. I want a tree that's going to stay compact, that's going to produce this type of taste of fruit, that's going to be disease resistant. So not going to get every disease in the book. So, and I want to, have it this kind of structure. And then the computer would come out with, okay, you need this type of rootstock, which will determine the mature tree size, and this type of scion wood, which is the top of the tree, the fruiting part of the tree. And, whereas Honeycrisp is not disease resistant, there are trees, apple trees like Liberty or Freedom, which people don't know about, which are disease resistant. So the humans are the computers. People who have done this for a long time, we know, what to match up together in order to customize a tree so that it is easier to grow for the grower. And again, it's not rocket science. It's something that we can teach easily.
Okay. So again, what are the hardiest, easiest trees for beginners? and which are the more advanced ones? It sounds like apple's more advanced.
Yeah,
What else?
I would say apples are more advanced. I would say if you're a beginner, if you want to grow, let's say, in your backyard, you might want a fruit tree on something called a semi-dwarfing rootstock. So the rootstock is the bottom part of the tree. It's a separate tree, and it's a semi-dwarf rootstock has a really sort of rugged root system. And so it'll be less likely to blow over or break, that kind of thing. For the top part of the tree, I would choose a disease-resistant variety. And while I said that apples are very advanced, if you get a disease-resistant variety like Liberty or Freedom or Nova Mac or Nova Spy, there's so many of them, or Pristine, which is one of my favorite disease-resistant apple trees. If the top part of the tree grafted onto that rootstock is one of those easier to grow varieties, then you're golden. Then you really just need to think about how to prevent the pests. And there are many easy ways to do that if you're going to go for an apple tree. If you're going to go for a stone fruit tree, every tree comes with its own little package of diseases and pests. But, some are less, like plum trees, depending on what kind of plum tree, it can be easier. But again, there's just a few techniques to learn in order to keep them healthy and productive.
Well, like such as what? Where's the big part of the work? Is it, before the fruit comes? Is that where most of the work is? Or is it after the fruit comes or the whole way? Like what is it?
I think it's a mix. Okay, so we talked a little bit about pruning. So you're going to be sculpting the tree. You do that every year. It's a lot of fun. People enjoy it. Let's talk about feeding. You need to feed your tree. So each spring, you're going to be laying out a couple of inches of compost around the roots of the tree, and that will break down into the soil and actually feed the tree roots. But in order for the tree to access that nutrition, it needs rain or irrigation, because fruit tree roots don't have little teeth. And so they have to take in their nutrition in liquid form. So by irrigating, or the rain will help to break down that nutrition with the help of, soil organisms, which will also break down that organic matter, and the tree gets nutrition. And I would say the third main thing you need to do is protect the tree. So either get a disease-resistant tree, which is always wise for a beginner, or when it comes to pests, this is one of the funnest things that I learned early on, because we weren't allowed to spray our trees in our park. We can't use chemicals on our trees. So that really limits you, because growers professionally use a lot of toxic chemicals to protect the fruit. There is something called, I call them orchard socks, or they're called maggot barriers, and they're essentially little nylons that you slip onto the baby fruit, whether it's an apple or a pear. Some people put it on apricots too, and other fruits. You slip it into this little nylon, you tie up the top by hand, and the nylon expands as the fruit grows. But what it does is it prevents insects from laying their eggs under the skin of the fruit. They can't get in there. You don't get those maggots, apple maggots and codling moth. So when I finally figured this out, it's a community orchard where I plant my fruit trees, where we grow our fruit trees. So we all came out, one day, and in the early spring or the early summer, when the little baby fruits had formed on the trees, and all of us went and tied on these little sockets on most of the fruit. Some of it we didn't reach, or we just forgot about, or somehow missed. By the end of the season, we saw that the covered fruitlets were perfect. They had no insect damage. And the ones that were uncovered, they were the ones that the insects got into. So to me, that was fabulous evidence that you can grow fruit trees without toxic chemicals and be successful, even apple trees, which can be challenging.
How many fruits are you talking about putting nylons on? Like hundreds? It's crazy.
Oh, well, we have
Is there a heuristic? Like if I have a tree of a certain size, I don't know if you go by height or breadth or whatever, and it has can it bear no more than 100 apples? Like, how do you know how many is too many, how many is too few? How do you kind of right size so it bears enough, but not too much or too little?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, absolutely. That's so very intuitive that you're saying that, because what happens with some trees, like apricot trees are a great example. So if you let all the fruitlets that form on the tree to grow, they'll sort of smush each other out, because apricots can be very productive. And these little fruitlets may be within, centimeters of each other. They're so tight together. So when they start to grow, none of them can grow to full size. They stay very hard. They're not tasty. And the other problem is, the tree only has a limited amount of energy. So if it's working on producing, let's say, 100 pieces of fruit, and it only really has energy for 50, you're going to have 100 terrible tasting pieces of fruit. But if you thin the fruit, and in the early season, when the fruitlets start to form, you pick off a certain number of fruitlets so that the other ones can grow full size to be juicy and delicious and sweet and take in that energy. So your question was, how do you know how many to leave? Well, when you look at a branch of a fruit tree and you see how strong it is or isn't, a young branch can break if it has too many fruits on it. And so you look at the branch and think, you know what? I think this branch can hold maybe 2 apricots or 10 apricots, but not 100. You thin it out, because if you think about how heavy the branch could break if there's 100 fruitlets on there. So over the years, you will thin the fruit. The stronger the tree is and the older it is, the more it can sustain more fruit. Here's the other thing. Sometimes people don't want a huge tree that produces 1,000, apples when they're just feeding their families. And apples don't last forever, so they'll throw half of them away. So it's not really about more is better. You want better quality, and you want the right amount for you, and your family to share with your community and with your friends and to give to the food bank, but you don't necessarily want your fruit tree to go all out and produce as much as possible.
Yeah, there's like an extreme example. My daughter had this in a Japanese restaurant. It was like some apple or whatever tree where they only grow one fruit on it. It's crazy expensive, but it's like super delicious. All the power and the juice goes into this one, apple or whatever, pear or whatever it is. I don't know if you heard about it, but it's an extreme
no
example,
idea.
I guess, of this.
Yeah. And here's the thing. I'll just tell you that, as I said, I grow our fruit trees in a community orchard, and our volunteers are fantastic, and we have a lot of fun, and we enjoy the cherry harvest because there's so many cherries on the tree. There's enough for lots of everybody. But the apples, people go to the park and they see the apples and they harvest them before they're ripe, which is heartbreaking for us because they don't even taste good at that time. And it means that when the apples do ripen, we, the volunteers, don't even get to taste them. Well, this year on one of the trees, people harvested the fruit on a lot of the trees. We have one tree that's been struggling for a few years. We're working on it. It's got a certain disease. We cut off the disease as we need to correctly. But I noticed the other day when we had our stewardship day that there were 2 fruits on the tree that were perfect. Some had been eaten. We didn't do orchard socks on that tree. We did thin the fruit though. Anyways, 2 were perfect. So I picked the fruit off, and at the end of stewardship, I came to the table with everybody. We have a harvest table. And I said, okay, guys, let's cut this up. There are 10 of us. think are 12. Let's divide it up so everybody gets a piece of this fruit to try. And we had never tried it because in all the other years, people harvested all the fruit early. We divided up the fruit. Everybody took a piece. It's a golden russet tree, apple tree. So everybody took a bite and we were all like silent. And one volunteer said, "Oh my gosh, if all fruit tasted this good, I would be eating a lot more healthy food." So what I'm trying to say here is when you grow it yourself in your own backyard or in your own community, when you give the tree the love and care that it needs, and you're not growing it on an industrial scale, you will be surprised at how good the fruit is. You don't need to have one fruit, a tree putting all its beautiful love and energy into one piece of fruit, though I don't see a problem with that. But you can have lots of fruit that is that delicious and special to have to share with your family and with your friends and with your community.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I remember years ago in Seattle, there's they still do, but blackberry trees or bushes grow everywhere. And we would pull them off the bushes and they were like amazingly delicious. And in the stores, even the organic blackberries just taste like nothing. They just water.
I agree. I totally
Even though they
agree.
look beautiful, but they just taste like nothing. So it's amazing. Yeah, I had a peach off a tree at my friend's house and it was delicious just right outside. So fruit off a tree cared for properly is like amazing compared to stuff you get in the store. Unbelievably
It's
different.
amazing. And nutritionally, I know that a lot of the stuff that you're interested is around human health. And honestly, if we want to be healthy, we need to be eating really nutritious foods. And, a lot of the soils in our commercial farms and orchards are a little bit bankrupt. They've been pushing out crops for years and years without a holiday, right? And the soil is tired and they're using, fertilizers that are made synthetically. And so when you have food that's grown in the old-fashioned way with the help of nature, It is incredible nutritionally and taste-wise what kind of product you will get, how it will taste, and how it can help your health. And the other thing about health I want to mention, it's not just about putting it in your mouth. It's about the connection that you develop with your tree, the connection with nature. And in our case, in a community orchard where you're working with your neighborhood friends, or you meet friends because you are involved in this project. There are people of all ages working in our community orchard on a volunteer basis. We've got volunteers who are in their 70s. We've got a 6-year-old volunteer. We've got everything in the middle. It is so healthy to be part of that type of network of people who know each other, connect. You don't feel so lonely, and that's good for your health too.
Have you grown any nut trees, or and do you do only trees? Have you done like bushes or vines or other stuff, or trees or enough?
So yes, we have planted nut trees. Nut trees are for the really patient. You talked about earlier on, if you really want to get sort of your crop sooner, well, nut trees take forever. We planted 2 shagbark hickory nut trees when we first planted the orchard in 2009. They still haven't they have not produced any nuts for us, and they're still young, right? Nut trees live a long time, and they take a long time to mature. We planted hazelnut bushes, which are I like them. They're very pretty. We planted those maybe 5 years ago. No harvest yet. The other problem is in an urban environment, we have a lot of squirrels, and because they don't have any natural predators to keep them in line. So the nut trees were more to have a wide diversity of plants so that we could learn about nut trees, but I'm not betting on us having much of a harvest for those trees. I think the squirrels are going to get there first.
Yeah. Okay.
In terms of, you also asked about berry bushes. We do have service berries, which are trees. They grow on trees. And we would like to start. The problem is our orchard is in a park, and the park supervisor has informed us that we are not to plant any more fruit trees because the park is too small and there needs to be room for people to play ball and to do this and that. So for now, it's fruit trees. There is a possibility that in the future I'll get involved in other projects, and I have, helped people out with other projects in my city. And so then I get a little bit more contact with growing berries. But for now in our park, it's really just fruit trees.
Well, you talked about urban gardening. So, what if I live in I don't know, how much room do I need to grow anything? Let's say I live in a city and I really don't have a lot of room in my yard. I barely have a yard. I have maybe a 2 square foot to 2 foot by 2 foot patch. That's it. Can I grow something? Like, what's the minimum?
2 foot by 2 foot is a bit small, but if you have full sun, that's the most important thing. If you've got a garden, front or back, with full sun and decent soil. So if you live in, let's say, a new development in the suburbs where they cleared out, there was a farm there maybe, and they cleared out all the farm stuff and they took away all the soil. They built some houses, and then they, on the subsoil, they rolled out a little bit of soil, rolled out some grass. That's not going to be ideal, even if there is full sun. But if you've got full sun, and if you can put a shovel in the ground and the soil is pretty deep, like at least a foot deep, and, pretty friable, can be sort of crumbled or worked with on your hands, then you can grow a fruit tree in a smallish space. So let's say you've got a garden, a postage stamp garden, as they say, that's maybe, 15 feet by 15 feet or something like that. You can actually grow small fruit trees, dwarfing fruit trees up against fences. It's called espalier. And it's a decorative way of growing fruit trees, but you still do get fruit. So these trees are pruned and trained so that they create shapes. The shape can be a candelabra. The shape can be sort of grid-like, but you can grow even a number of fruit trees along a fence that way, keeping them very small. But they do have to be on the right rootstock. You have to start when they are just 1 year old, and you have to know what you're doing, which is easy. And it's something that I teach, and it can be learned very easily.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, what are some resources for listeners so they could dip their toe in and try to grow their first tree?
Well, I would say that if somebody is thinking of planting a fruit tree, I am so happy to get them at that stage when they're just thinking about it. For somebody who's thinking of planting a tree, or somebody who's just planted a tree, or even somebody who's planted a tree and can't figure out why things aren't working for them, my book is called Grow Fruit Trees Fast, and they can find it on Amazon in a local Amazon store. Grow Fruit Trees Fast by Susan Poizner. I designed it so you can read it in 1 hour. And in 1 hour, you will know how to plant a fruit tree so that it is successful. What are the jobs involved? What do you need to do? And if you have a fruit tree you've been having challenges with, you will get some tips on how to make that fruit tree more successful, how to help it so that it can be productive. So that's one resource I would suggest. I also have my website, orchardpeople.com, where I have articles, I have a monthly podcast, and I also have online courses. So I can teach you anything. I've got a course called Certificate in Fruit Tree Care, and in 8 hours, you will learn how to grow fruit trees successfully, and you're well on your way. So hopefully some of your listeners, if they're interested, they will check it out. But one of the things that I have designed my resources for is for those people who want to grow fruit trees and they're just about to go to the garden center or the big box store to buy a fruit tree. If possible, I'd love to get you before you do that, because I'm going to help you choose a different tree that's easier to grow.
Okay, well, very good. Well, Susan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Before you stop listening, ask yourself, what are 1 or 2 useful things you heard on this podcast that can help you overcome food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation? Please like and subscribe and tell your friends and family about their Surviving Hard Times podcast. We're all going to need help now and in the near future.